In our previous videos, we've been looking at demand. So we looked at the definition of demand, individual demand versus market demand, and so on. What I want to do in this video is look at supply. So we're similarly going to define supply, market supply, individual supply, so that we can compare these definitions. So let's start with what we know about demand. When we define demand, demand is the relationship between price and the amount consumers are willing and able to buy. So notice in this definition, we have a price change, and we're looking at how when price changes, it changes the amount that consumers are willing and able to buy. We know demand is the consumer perspective, and in our previous videos, we've looked at how we can derive demand by looking at what individuals are willing to buy, their preferences, which we can represent with indifference curves or marginal utility, and we looked at what they're able to buy. We looked at constraint, we looked at cost, we created a budget line, and considered opportunity cost. So demand is the relationship between price and the amount that consumers are willing and able to buy. When we went from individual demand to market demand, we found market demand by adding that amount that consumers were willing and able to buy, that quantity demanded, at every price. So it showed us the overall relationship between price and the amount that multiple consumers were willing and able to buy. So now let's consider the definition of supply. Supply is from the business or producer's perspective. So when we define supply, we are looking at the relationship between price and the amount producers are willing and able to sell. So again, we're looking at how a price change changes quantity. This time though, we're looking at that quantity, that amount, from the producer perspective instead of the consumer, but still we're looking at willing and able. So when we consider a business, businesses have to look at how much they are willing to sell, right? So they have to consider, are they making an appropriate profit margin? Is this something that they're interested in even making and selling? So why are they specializing in this particular product? And are they able to sell it? Can they make it for a cost that is below the price the market says it should be bought and sold at? So they have to be willing and able to sell. So supply is the relationship between price and that quantity supplied. So just like demand had quantity demanded, that was this amount here that consumers were willing and able to buy, the amount that producers are willing and able to sell, that's quantity supplied. So to find the market supply, we would just add quantity supplied from each producer at each price. So we're going to look at this. We're going to look at an example of this, how we get that market demand and market supply. And ultimately, we're going to look at what the price is in the market. So how do we get to that equilibrium? What is the price and the quantity sold? So let's start with this example here. So let's look at the market for craft beer. Okay, so here we have our prices per case, and here we have the amount that a consumer is willing and able to buy in a month. So we need to set a time period. Now, we can look at this in table form, and if we look at it in table form, we have what is called a demand schedule. The demand schedule looks at that relationship between price and quantity demanded, the amount the consumer is willing and able to buy. Well, notice here that when the price goes up, what happens to the amount the consumer is willing and able to buy? The price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. This is the law of demand. Price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. And if you recall from the other videos, why does this law of demand exist? How come when prices go up, the amount you are willing and able to buy goes down? Well, we have two effects that explain the law of demand. What were they? The income effect and the substitution effect. So the income effect says that when this price goes up, well, we haven't had a change to our actual income, but because things are now more expensive, can you afford as much? No, so your real income or your buying power is less, and since the money you have in your pocket doesn't go as far, quantity demanded will go down. So the income effect is referring to your real income or your buying power. We also have the substitution effect. The substitution effect says when the price goes up, well, now there are other things that we like equivalent to this craft beer, so we might switch. So as the price of craft beer goes up, we're going to switch to a substitute, an alternative, which means the quantity demanded of craft beer will go down. So it is the income effect and the substitution effect that create this law of demand. The fact that when the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. If we graph this information, then what we get is a downward sloping demand curve. We can see this relationship between price and quantity demanded. As the price goes up, the amount we're willing and able to buy goes down. Well, this is an individual demand curve. To find the market demand curve, we would need to add up the quantity demanded at each price. So if the first person we looked at, here is their demand schedule, we can add to it the quantity demanded from everyone else. So at a price of $18 per case, if person number 1 was willing to buy 6 cases in a month, and everyone else collectively is willing to buy 16, we can then add that together to get the quantity demanded for everyone at that price. And so take a moment and find the market demand on our table here. So 13 plus 5 is 18, 4 plus 12 is 16, 3 plus 6 is 9, and 2 plus 4 is 6. So we can see for our market demand, we are still following the law of demand. The price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. So the market demand curve comes from simply adding those quantity demandeds at each price. Well, this is from the perspective of the consumer. So now let's switch gears and look at it from the perspective of the business. So let's look at supply. Again, we can represent this in a table. And because this is the producer, the business, this is the supply schedule. So again, it shows the relationship between price, but now it's showing the amount that businesses are willing and able to sell. So let's look at this individual supply. Here, as the price goes up, what do you notice about quantity supplied? Notice that when the price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. Now, take a guess what this relationship is called. The law of supply. Okay. So you'll notice there's similar naming schemes and terminology on the demand side and the supply side. So why do we have the law of supply? Why is it when the price goes up, quantity supplied goes up? Well, remember, the only thing we are changing here is price. We are holding everything else constant. What do you call that when you hold everything else constant? What's that economic term? It's a Latin word. Ceteris paribus, or ceteris paribus is the Latin. So everything else is being held constant. The only thing we're changing here is the price. Well, as a business, if you can sell your craft beer for a higher price and we're holding constant the cost to make it, does that make you more or less happy? Higher profit margin sounds better, right? So if we can charge a higher price for our product and we haven't changed the cost, then we want to sell more at those higher prices. So we get the law of supply. Now, it is a little bit more complicated than that. We're going to look at that in more detail in upcoming videos because there is a change in cost the more you produce. But right now, we're just going to look at it very simplistically. Higher prices, ceteris paribus, higher profits, we want to sell more. We'll look at the cost to the business in more detail in future videos. Okay. So here we have our individual supply represented as a table. So here's a supply schedule. Here's the supply curve. The price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. Well, this is an individual supply curve. It's one business. We want to look at the market supply curve. So we have to consider all the other producers of our craft beer. So how do we find market supply? We need to add up quantity supplied at every price. So if the first business was a very small business and so they were making a handful of cases per month, we can add them to everyone else who's making craft beer to find our quantity supplied at each price. So let's take a moment and let's add these up to get our quantity supplied. So we have 6 and 2 is 8, 9 and 3 is 12, 4 and 12 is 16, 5 and 15 is 20, and 8 and 16 is 24. So here we have it represented on a supply schedule. You can see here we have our market supply, which simply comes from just adding up these quantity supplied at each price. And notice here the market supply follows that law of supply. When the price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. So what we're going to do in our next video is we're going to take that market demand and market supply and start to look at how they interact. We want to find our market equilibrium. This market equilibrium will determine the price in the market. So our market price or our equilibrium price is the amount that you would actually pay when you go to buy the craft beer. It's based on market demand, so how much collectively consumers are willing and able to buy at different prices. And it is based on market supply, the amount collectively that businesses are willing and able to sell. At this equilibrium point here, this point is where quantity demanded, the amount the customers want to buy, is equal to quantity supplied, the amount that businesses are willing to sell. And so because those quantities match, we're at equilibrium. Equilibrium means there's no incentive to change, things are stable. And so that's why the price in the market may not just constantly change every 2 seconds, because we're at that place that's stable. There's no incentive to change. So we're going to look at how we get to that equilibrium and define that in our next video. But as we're looking at definitions in this video, let's look at one more definition. And that's the difference between a change in demand and quantity demanded, a change in supply and quantity supplied. So here we have our downward sloping demand curve. If you change price, so if we go from $19 to $17, that decrease in price causes quantity demanded to go up. Price goes from 19 to 17. Quantity demanded in this example goes from 5 to 7. So a price change changes quantity demanded. In our previous videos, we looked at how we could change things like income and preferences and the price of substitutes. Those types of things changed demand. They changed the amount we were willing and able to buy at every price. So notice here, this is a higher quantity demanded at the $19 price and a higher quantity demanded at the $17 price. So price changes quantity demanded. Those other determinants of demand, there were 6 of them. See if you can remember what they are. They changed demand. Alternatively, if we look at the supply curve, so here's our upward sloping supply curve. When we change price here, when we change the price, it changes quantity demanded. Quantity supplied. Well, make sure we're talking about producers, businesses here. So a price change changes quantity supplied. It does not change supply. We're still on the same supply curve. There are, however, determinants of supply, and we're going to learn those in the next video. Those determinants of supply can change the amount that businesses are willing and able to produce at every price. So you can see here the quantity supplied is higher at this price and higher at that price. So we need to distinguish between a change in quantity supplied, which is caused by a price change, and what changes supply, like the number of businesses, technology, taxes on businesses. Those types of things are going to change the amount the business is willing and able to sell at every price. And we can see a supply increase or a shift to the right. We could also see a supply decrease or a shift to the left, where businesses are willing and able to sell less at every price. So we want to make sure we know the difference between a change in demand and quantity demanded, and a change in supply and quantity supplied.